Dress, for that wonderful introduction and for inviting me, and also to say that this is a really extraordinary moment, I think, for many of us, in that really for the first time we can say that we're having kind of a group intellectual orgy, a sort of an orgasm of mental ideas. And it's not often that you can say that in public, so I'll say it here. I want to start off with an example that we're all very familiar with, which is the way we greet each other. And it's, of course, very common in many cultures for greetings to take place where you shake someone's hand, or now this very hip kind of greeting that Obama is engaging, or high fives. These are not so much in terms of very intimate body contact, but it can ramp up a little bit. Here's a greeting pulling in close. As in this country, there's a kiss on the cheek. In France, it's 2 kisses on the cheek, and in Holland, it's 3 typically. And among the Russians, it's a kiss on the lips. Now, that seems maybe a little bit odd. I mean, it's not very comfortable for us to do that. But here's 2 puzzles about the nature of greeting that in no culture ever documented, no country existing, have the following things ever happened. No culture kisses another person by sticking their tongue in the other person's mouth. Now, the question there is why? I mean, the Russians are very close because they're going lip to lip, so why not go the extra, inch and put the tongue forward? That's puzzle number 1. Puzzle number 2 is the following. Many countries have an experience where a mother or father will kiss their child on the tush, right, on the bum, right? And this seems perfectly okay, right? It happens in some countries, not others, that's okay. But now ask yourself the following question. Has any parent ever kissed the tush of their 18-year-old son or daughter? And the answer is no. But why not? They're still very affectionate, still the same relationship in terms of their kinship, but that doesn't happen either. Why? Why do we sense the sense of disgust and it being morally wrong for a parent to do that? Where does that come from? Well, the question I want to address today in the short time I have is, where do our morals come from? And of course, this is a monumental question, but I want to show you today how some of the sciences have begun to pick apart at very age-old questions that only philosophers for a very long time had addressed. This is not to say that scientists have pushed over philosophers, but rather that scientists have engaged in questions that philosophers have engaged in, and now can begin to provide maybe some evidence that might help think about the different questions that have been raised. So here's one view. I will pin it on the philosopher David Hume, a British empirical philosopher, who held to the view that our emotions are critical to generating how we think about right and wrong. Franz de Waal earlier this morning talked about how animals have certain emotions and they fuel compassionate interactions, altruistic interactions, and this is the view that Hume basically held to. It's an intuitive perspective. We don't kind of consciously think about those emotions. They just percolate up and they tell us what's right or wrong. A second view, really kind of the opposite view, can be attributed to many people, but Kant was one who had this view, which is that when we think about right or wrong, we deliberate over certain kinds of rules or principles, and we can explicate them. It's very conscious, it's deliberative, completely different from the Humean view. A third view is a theistic view, that where we get our ideas for what's right or wrong is from Scripture, from divine inspiration, from something written in texts that tell us what's right or wrong. In this sense, morality and some aspect of a theistic view are one and the same. And therefore, in the absence of any theistic view, you simply don't have the right moral compass, or perhaps any moral compass at all. The last view, which is the one I'm going to push on very heavily today, is a view that can be attributed to the political philosopher John Rawls, who tried to make an analogy between how the linguist Noam Chomsky has thought about language. And that is, in the same way that there's a universal grammar that underpins all of the variation in the languages we see throughout the world, comparably, so Rawls argued, there's a universal moral grammar. That is, there's a shared substrate, biologically given, that underpins how every one of us, regardless of where we're from, thinks about and judges moral situations. Critically for today, I want to distinguish between how we judge and what you do. Both Phil Zimbardo and Randy Cohn, in their 2 talks, were speaking about how we can motivate good behavior, heroic behavior, or simply good behavior. Today I want us to think about how our systems in the brain generate intuitions about right and wrong in terms simply of the judgment, and we'll come toward the end about how to link up judgment with behavior. So here's a way of thinking about it. Let's imagine kind of a Humean view of the world, and if you can't see what's going on up here, I can't flash that, imagine you've just seen a person with a dagger standing over a dead body. Now on the Humean view, the view of emotion, you are going to feel a certain way. The perception of the event triggers an emotion, and that emotion gives you the moral judgment. That's the end of the story. On a combination of kind of Hume and Kant and the theistic view, you perceive that event, part of your brain triggers an emotion, but part triggers some kind of rational deliberation. If you're a theistically inclined or religiously inclined person, you may think of something that you've learned in Scripture, something you've read about that says, don't do this or do this. Those 2 things will compete in the brain, and eventually you'll come to a conclusion. It's right or it's wrong. On this last view that I'm going to again push on, the Rawlsian view, although emotion and conscious reasoning are taking place, as you'll see to the far right, they happen after the judgment. The judgment itself is simply driven by our ability to infer what people believe, what they intend, what they are desiring, and how those systems of mind connect up with the outcomes of an event. Now, up until very recently, these were aspects of moral psychology that were debated in philosophy, but there really weren't any empirical data that really could answer how this system is actually working. So now let's imagine something which is actually not too hard to imagine nowadays, which is that we have a deep understanding of how the brain triggers and supports our emotional responses. If we had an individual whose emotional systems were deeply suppressed, such that they didn't feel anything about the world, then on the top view, the Humean view, if the emotions are knocked out, the moral judgments are knocked out as well. They should be very abnormal relative to anybody else. On this second view, any kind of moral situation in which the emotions are recruited, that kind of individual would suffer because they would have no emotions to recruit. But some moral situations could be answered in a completely cool and cold way. If I asked you the question, everything else equal, if you could save 1 person that you didn't know or 5 people that you didn't know, clearly everybody goes for the 5. Okay, no problem. But on this last view, if the emotional systems are knocked out, it's completely irrelevant to the moral judgment because the judgment is made in the absence of emotion. And on this last Rawlsian view, the emotions are affecting possibly behavior, but not judgment. Well, do we have such patients? Yes, we do. They're called psychopaths, and they're called people with damage to the frontal lobes. These people have a greatly suppressed emotional response to many events in the world, particularly emotional events. And what we'll come to in a moment is how studies of psychopaths may greatly illuminate these particularly deep and ancient philosophical debates. Now, the first thing I have to tell you about today, before I actually show you some experiments, is that I'm going to be focusing on artificially invented moral situations rather than real-world events. And there's a reason for that. For real-world situations, you already have an opinion. If I ask you, is abortion right or wrong, you've got a view. And you've got a view that you can explain. You think there's something important about the sanctity of life, or not. But if I give you an artificial case that taps something important about the psychology of harming or helping others, then I've removed you from a context which you've rehearsed, and I can better capture the intuition. Now, importantly, sometimes these artificial cases actually appear in the real world, and here's a good example of one. A couple of years ago, a woman was visiting some caves in South Africa, and she went up to the ticket booth and said, "Can I please have a ticket to go in?" The man said, look, ma'am, I'm sorry, but you're actually too large to fit through our tunneling systems. You can't go. She begged and pleaded, and eventually she got in. Well, she got stuck. But not only did she get stuck at the only exit of the caves, and she trapped 22 people behind her. One person was diabetic. If he didn't get out in 24 hours, he was dead. Now, I want you to vote on the following question. Is it permissible to blow up the fat lady? Raise your hand. Only a few of you. Those of you who didn't vote, either you're just being kind of, pathetic about it, or you've not thought through the problem. Because if she stays there and dies, then not only does she die, but so do the 22 people behind her. So taking her out benefits the greater good. 22 people survive, and she was going to die anyways. Well, fortunately for her and everybody else, after 10 hours, with a little bit of paraffin, they squeaked her out. Okay, let's now go right into the experiments and give you some examples of how the science have begun to address these problems. What about the Humean view? What about psychopaths? Psychopaths have been discussed in the media. They're all over Hollywood. Who are these people and what's the problem? Well, one possibility is because they lack empathy, they lack a concern for the other, they can't even imagine what it's like to be someone feeling something. They just don't know right from wrong. Their emotions are screwed up, and so too is their moral knowledge. A second possibility is that they just don't understand the moral world. They just have no clue, right? Emotions or not, they just don't understand. And the third possibility is they understand the moral world perfectly well. They just don't care. Okay, how can we understand what's going on? Well, here's a study that some colleagues of mine in Holland did. We tested 14 prison-convicted, clinically diagnosed psychopaths. We compared their responses to moral situations with convicts who had been convicted of the same crimes but were not psychopaths, and healthy control individuals, same age, same gender, all males. They were given 21 different moral dilemmas, cases where there's no clear way of deciding one way or the other which way you should go. Some of those cases were what we called impersonal dilemmas, and some were personal. Impersonal meaning you could kind of flip a switch or yell or do something where you didn't have to touch the individual to harm them, versus personal, kind of up close and personal, pushing someone. So in impersonal cases, like up here, imagine a runaway trolley. The trolley, if it continues down a track, will kill 5 people. But if you flip a switch, you can turn the trolley onto a side track where it will kill 1. Is that permissible? The opposing case is you can throw somebody off the bridge, killing him, but saving the 5. That's up close and personal. Here are the data. On the y-axis, you see the proportion of judgments that say, yes, I endorse that action. And on the x-axis are the impersonal versus personal cases. For the impersonal cases, you see these 3 clusters of dots. Those stand for purple being the psychopaths, green the delinquents, and the blue normal. There's no difference. These groups of people judge them exactly the same way for the impersonal case. And the same is exactly the same for the personal. There are, in other words, no group differences. Psychopaths do not differ from anyone else in this room in terms of how they judge moral dilemmas. The crucial point here is psychopaths know about harm, they just don't care. This, in my opinion, does real damage to the Humean view, and that is the emotions aren't the inspiration for what's right or wrong, but they greatly affect what we do. Okay, what about the Kantian view? Are there data that bear on thinking through the problem, consciously and reasoning through it? Let's take another one of these trolley problems just to illustrate it, but many examples fit the story I'm about to tell you. Here comes the trolley again. It will kill 5 people if it continues. You can flip a switch, turning on this little loop track. It will kill this big guy, but he's big enough to stop the trolley from continuing and thereby saving the 5. When you ask people on an internet website with thousands of subjects, about half the people say yes. Okay, so they're not really clear, but half people say, yes, that's okay. Now, here's a very similar case. There goes the trolley, there's 5 people, there's the loop, there's the guy on the loop. If you flip the switch now, it kills the guy on the loop track, but he's not big enough to stop the trolley. Only the weight in front of him is. Okay? How many people say this is yes? 76%, significantly more than in the previous case. So let's bring these two up and ask, well, what's the difference? Well, the difference is, in the first case, you are using that one guy as the means to saving the 5, whereas in the second case, the one guy is simply a casualty, an accident. Now, if we ask people, you decided this case was worse than that case, why? Virtually no one has a clue why, even though they judge them very robustly. And for those who went to Catholic school and who learned Scripture, they clearly should have remembered that this distinction goes back to St. Thomas Aquinas. This is called the doctrine of double effect. It is permissible to harm one to save many if you don't use the one as the means to the greater good. So clearly, these cases are being decided without any knowledge of why. It's unconscious, it's intuitive, and it's not about emotion. That takes out the Kantian view that we reason from principles. What about the theistic view? Well, we have a website, and I'd welcome all of you to kind of go onto the website. It's a website which allows people to log on and answer a variety of moral dilemmas. We've had hundreds of thousands of subjects logged on. It's in Spanish now, in 5 or 6 other languages. The data set I want to tell you about right now includes 10,000 subjects, 150 different kinds of dilemmas, so a lot of variation, about harming others, helping others, a wide variety of cultural and demographic factors, differences obviously in gender, education, religious background, experience with moral coursework, and political affiliation. Here's a pie of how much each of these variables contributes to distinctions that people are making. Okay? What are these variables? Well, here's a tiny slice, which is sex. Here's a tiny slice, which is political affiliation. Here's a tiny slice for educational level. Here's one for moral education. And here's the one for religion. In other words, the entire variation practically is all due to non-cultural, non-demographic factors. The differences are, is it a means? Is it a side effect? Is it an action? Is it a mission? These cultural and demographic factors have virtually no effect on people's moral judgments. If religion was giving the difference, you'd find a difference, but you don't. People who have a religious background show no differences in their pattern judgments with atheists. That does damage to the theistic view, leaving us with the Rawlsian view, which I want to end with. We've uncovered now over the past several years, and this is not only the work from my own lab, but from many labs throughout the US and other places as well, 4 abstract principles. This goes back to the talk that Carl Grammer gave about mating. These have no content. They're just very abstract variables that cultures can fill in. And the principles are the following. People judge means-based harms as worse than side effects. That's the one I just told you about. They judge actions as worse than omissions. They judge contact with somebody that harms them as more bad than non-contact. And they judge cases that are evitable harm, that you could avoid the harm, as worse than inevitable harms, just like the woman in the cave. She was an inevitable harm if you hadn't had the luck of popping her out with paraffin. But let's talk about something even more abstract, which comes back to an earlier talk today about the notion of beliefs. Beliefs are very abstract. We can have lots of different beliefs about lots of things, and so too with outcomes. In various kinds of religions, they put different weight, at least in the folk views of religions, on beliefs and outcomes. So Protestants typically think that you've sinned if you've had a bad belief and a bad outcome. But in the Judaic tradition, more commonly, a folk view of the Judaic tradition, is that it's really about the outcomes more than it is about the beliefs. In development, children are much more sensitive to outcomes, and only later do they bring together outcomes and beliefs. There are brain mechanisms, specifically a part of your temporal lobe, right about here, which is very much heavily involved in your attribution of beliefs. And then lastly, the law is critically very sensitive to the relationship between beliefs and outcomes. Now, because of time, I'm going to go a little bit faster here. We've looked at different kinds of moral dilemmas which put beliefs and outcomes against each other, and they start off with scenarios like this. Grace puts some powder in her friend's coffee, and then either there's a negative belief about harming her friend or a neutral belief, and either the outcome is negative, the person dies, or neutral, nothing happens. So for example, in the critical case, down here on the bottom, Grace thinks the powder is toxic, it turns out it's sugar, and her friend is fine. This is an attempted harm. The crucial opposite one is an accidental one. Grace thinks the powder is sugar, it turns out to be toxic, her friend dies. So if you look at how people judge these things, people judge the negative belief and negative outcome as very forbidden, very bad, and they judge the neutral belief and neutral outcome as very permissible. That makes sense. But importantly, they judge the attempted harm as a more forbidden case than they do the accidental harm. So at this level, beliefs and outcomes are both playing a role, even though our subjects come from very different denominations. Basically, we're all natural Protestants, like it or not. Here's where the science gets interesting. There's a technique called transcranial magnetic stimulation. And in brief, what it does is it puts noise into your brain's nervous system and suppresses activity in that area. So we can suppress activity in this temporal lobe area and therefore suppress beliefs. And when we do that, we find a complete transformation so that the belief system plays no role in people's moral judgments. So effectively what we've done, in a faux kind of way, is we've turned off the Protestant view and we've turned on the Jewish view. Beliefs now no longer having any weight. Outcomes are driving the situation. So what I want to conclude with is that we are all universal Rawlsians, irrespective of cultural background, irrespective of education, religious background. We have a very complex grammar that underpins our moral judgments. This is important because it's something that we can tap. This is how humanity comes together. It's underpinned by a universal code of action. And I hope that this will give us some hope that biology can help explain our moral state that we've come to from our chimpanzee past. Thank you.